Hello. In this video, I want to talk about Sweden that has chosen to go and fight against the COVID-19 using its own strategy that is drastically different to the rest of the world. Before I jump into the Sweden, just wanted to do a quick overview of what's happening in the US. You could see that looking at the latest numbers, we're now back in green. The rate of improvement is very small, 0.14%, but that's still very good. The other piece of, good news is we had pretty high death counts last several days. So the day before it was 1939, then it was 1973. I was kind of scared to see what the numbers would be today. Looks like they're starting to come down, so I'm really hoping that those death numbers have peaked, much like the new cases numbers. So let's hope that that downward trend in deaths will continue. So before I jump into Sweden, as we know, decided not to follow the complete quarantine and shutdown, lockdown policies, whichever you want to call it, in its country. They are mitigating in many ways. It's not like they're doing nothing, but they are not using the draconian economy, let's say, destroying methods that most of the world has chosen to do. And before we look at the Swedish numbers, let's take a look at what a hardcore mitigation strategy looks like if you look at individual states. Well, you could kind of see it in the US. So the policies get implemented here around March 20th, something thereabouts. You see about 10 to 12 days of numbers rising. You could say exponentially, but it looks like a straight line here. Then after about 10 to 12 days, numbers stabilize, and then it's kind of parallel line from there on, and eventually the numbers level off. So you could see the same trend looking at New York. So about 10 days of growth, then the rest kind of leveling off. You could see the same in New Jersey, about 10 days of growth and then leveling off, Michigan and so forth. The same occurs actually in other countries as well. So if I clear out US, and let's take a look, for example, at Italy. So we have this growth for 10 days before the lockdown effects take place, and then we can see either flattening or decrease in the curve. Same is happening in Spain. Same is happening in Germany. Growth, flattening, and gradual reduction. Now let's take a look at Sweden. Sweden has decided not to implement it, and you could see that where you see a lot of green and yellow bars across next to some of these countries, you could see that Sweden actually is in red, and that is obviously not good. But what's interesting is that Sweden is a country of roughly 10 million people. So let's zero in on this data point so we can see the details. So currently we have about 8,000 cases, and we have about 905 cases per 1 million, or some you could hear that would be the same as 9 people per 1,000. And the population is about 10 million. If we compare Sweden to, let's say, Switzerland is very similar in population. It's a little smaller. And it has been extremely draconian, extremely rigorous in its mitigation strategy, complete lockdown and so forth. So, and you can see that mitigation strategy working, right? So we see the rapid rise for about 10 to 12 days, and then gradual slowing down of the curve. The reason and the other country that I think will be interesting to look at is Norway. So Norway is a neighbor of Sweden, and their policy was drastically different. Aggressive shutdown, and you can see again about 10 days of growth, and then numbers are falling quite rapidly. In fact, if you look at my D0 estimate, if numbers keep following at the same rate, disease might be totally eradicated in Norway in about 25 days. So there's a couple of interesting things happening with Sweden relative to Switzerland. So Norway is roughly about half of Sweden. And if you look at the total cases, in Norway we have about 6,200 total cases, and in Sweden we have 9,000 total cases. However, in Norway cases are shrinking, whereas in Sweden cases are growing, and they're growing at an average almost 20% daily. So that's troubling. However, there is still, if you compare them with another country their size like Switzerland, the daily count for Sweden was 722, whereas in Switzerland it was 777, with aggressive mitigation strategy implemented. So I guess it's very early for us to draw any conclusions. I just think it's interesting and definitely something to watch, because we don't have a lot of data. It's not going to be news to anybody that the mitigation strategies that most countries decided to implement are going to have catastrophic impact on their economy. And Sweden decided not to effectively destroy its economy. At least, so the reason we're told that the mitigation strategy makes sense is because the economy is going to be affected either way, either by death of people or by mitigation strategy. So I think we need to be watching Sweden. We don't have a lot of countries, fortunately or unfortunately, draw your own conclusions for this analysis. But I think Sweden will be an interesting, maybe an outlier or maybe a use case on how such events, these diseases, may be managed, and hopefully, we will be learning from all other countries in which strategies are effective in certain scenarios. So, if I can use that on the positive side, again, use your own, with double quotes, I guess. Sweden, even though it has not implemented a draconian mitigation policy, did not shut down its economy. Its new cases today are comparable to new cases of Switzerland, a company of fairly similar size. Again, I understand there is vast differences in demographics and population density and so forth. So all of that is duly noted. I'm just saying that these are right now we're not drawing any conclusions. The whole point of this video is just to point out that we have an interesting country to watch for the next several days and see what happens with this country given its choice with the strategy of dealing with the disease, right? So on a somewhat positive side, their cases are not as bad as Switzerland. However, if we look into mortality, I think there's some troubling things coming out, and we should definitely be watching Sweden to see what's happening. So as we see the mortality in Sweden right now, overall mortality sits at about 7.68%. And then the effective mortality, so over the last week or so, is 11.32%. So my prediction is that over the next several days, Switzerland will go from 7.6% to somewhere closer to 10%, right? As the growth of the cases start influencing the mortality rate. So if I click on Sweden, we can also see that their medical system is starting to get overwhelmed, right? So this is a very similar case to, I think, Spain, Italy, no, France, no, United Kingdom. So you could see that in the United Kingdom, earlier the mortality was very low, and then as new cases start piling up, the mortality is starting to spike up. So we can see that this warning that we heard that as cases start piling up, the the system can become overwhelmed. At least from the data perspective, it appears to be happening in Sweden. So when the cases were fairly low, the mortality was very low. So we're looking at 2%, 4%. And then as cases start to pile up, we can see mortality going to 7.73% and as high as 14%. So now it's come down a little bit as the new cases have come down, which is interesting, because why are new cases coming down? Well, it's not like that Sweden is doing nothing. Again, they've closed some, the schools. They've implemented some rules on large gatherings. However, the borders are open, bars, restaurants are open. So there's going to be some things we'll be learning from what works and what doesn't in our countries. So we definitely see some interesting things happening in Sweden. And we also see that there's some negative things happening to their health system as the number of cases grows. So I think Sweden is going to be important for us to pay attention to over the next several days. What I'm hoping to see is that there's this conversation about R0. The question is how many asymptomatic cases are in Sweden, and has Sweden reached the point where they're starting to develop herd immunity? The numbers I'm hearing right now is 50, 60, 70% of population needs to have antibodies before the herd immunity is achieved. So right now, according to the data we have available, they have they have not reached 1,000 cases per million yet. We're still, it's still early to say, how much of the population has been infected. So let's, I think we should be watching Sweden for the next couple of days. Again, I'm hoping that these cases, we could see that cases have been coming down starting from April the 2nd. So I'm curious how much of it is due to some additional measures that were put in, possibly a week before, with social distancing and other guidelines in Sweden. How much of it is due to more and more percentage of population starting to carry the antibodies. So I will keep monitoring Sweden, probably give it another week or so before I do another update. Hopefully we'll have more data. I'm sure that every country is looking at Sweden right now. I'm hoping that their health and medical system will be on par and will be able to handle the demand. And let's check back again in a couple of days for the new video. Thank you. Bye.